Bitcoin is apolitical. We ascribe our own belief structures onto it. And so, in the early days, there was a lot of libertarians, came at it for the monetary policy. But, I looked at the programming side, and what I saw was essentially, communism. The open source software, there's no one getting paid for it. Each person to their own. Everybody contributes to this shared project altruistically. Whereas the monetary policy might be, more libertarian focused, the development of it is rather progressive. So somehow Satoshi Nakamoto managed to combine these two diametrically opposed ideologies into a single project. And, again, redistribution of wealth. That's right out of Occupy Wall Street. I wish Elizabeth Warren could see the mass redistribution event. It's the first asset in human history where corporations and the powerful didn't have access to it first.
Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, where we explore the intersection of Bitcoin and progressive issues. I'm your host, Mark Stefani. My guest today is Nathaniel Harmon. Nathaniel received his master's in Marine Geology and Geochemistry from the University of Hawaii and has since been involved in improving the energy infrastructure in a sustainable manner for the Hawaiian Islands. In 2020, Nathaniel and his wife, Kristen Harmon, founded the Hawaiian Islands Conservation Collective in an effort to harness locally educated scientists to restore native ecosystems. Nathaniel has been involved with Bitcoin since 2013, and his most recent venture, OceanBit Energy, is focused on bringing the unique properties of Bitcoin mining to make ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, a more viable and sustainable energy solution, not only for the Hawaiian Islands, but the more than 1 billion people who live around the equator. All I'll say is that this was an incredibly fascinating conversation, and I know you'll enjoy it. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right. Well, Nathaniel Harmon, thank you so much for joining me on the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely. So while you've been into Bitcoin since 2013, you were relatively new to Bitcoin Twitter and the podcast world. So please tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I have a master's degree in marine geochemistry and geology and geochemistry. So I'm an ocean chemist. I've been out here in Hawaii for about 10 years. I was a scuba instructor at one point in my life, many, many, many years ago. And, I've just loved the ocean ever since I was a small child. Who doesn't love the ocean, right?
What are you working on now?
I've got a couple of projects. I have Blockchain Solutions Hawaii, which is like a consulting firm for local companies, integration, stuff like that. And then I'm working on an energy project. So using ocean thermal energy conversion and trying to bring that to as many people as possible.
And we will certainly get to that. But first, when you learned about Bitcoin back in 2013, I believe, how did it fit into your political views and value systems at that time?
At that time, 2013, I really wasn't thinking about it so much. I remember during the Bush years, protesting the war in Atlanta. I was in Atlanta at the time during the Bush years and protesting there. I remember Occupy Wall Street, being a big fan. And honestly, in 2013, I was just looking for a way to buy weed on the internet. And it was so small at the time. I didn't, it never really, it took a few years before I really started to consider the implications of, Bitcoin for the general population. So it wasn't really until 2016 that I got, political about it. During the 2015 run up to the presidential election, I had discovered Bernie Sanders very early on. I remember his one the one talk he gave when he announced that nobody covered, I remember listening to that and thinking, yeah, okay, let's go. So I went out and I started the Students for Sanders on UH campus, which ended up evolving into the the statewide campaign for Bernie. And that was when I started to kind of connect the dots between Bitcoin and a lot of my progressive beliefs. Having come out of the Occupy Wall Street, I realized that a lot of the problems in the world are attributable to banking, and I looked at Bitcoin as sort of a redistribution event, a global redistribution event, sort of in line with some of the writings of Thomas Piketty. He talked about there's two real good ways to redistribute capital from, once capital starts, getting piled up at the top, they have the interest rates that they can get from paying all the best, MBAs in the world and quants. They can get this increased rate of return that, without a progressive tax rate, it just sort of starts piling up. And there's two really good ways to redistribute it. You can do it through war. Obviously, World War I, World War II destroyed all the legacy capital of Europe. And, that's, the rebuilding of it led to the redistribution of that wealth. And then you can also have an industrial revolution, which at the time I was kind of into the Jeremy Rifkin stuff, the third industrial revolution. And I was looking at, Bitcoin as the peaceful alternative to, the war redistribution route. And, the ability to freely move and, how dictators would essentially take their entire country hostage via monetary policy, and the ability for people to escape that really caught my eye. And at the time it wasn't really a controversial opinion because Bitcoin was so small in 2016. And then later I saw a sort of shift, and where the people who I was talking to, where we would have nice conversations about it, sort of shifted towards negative opinions and assuming that I'm some sort of libertarian, anarcho-capitalist or whatever.
Were you able to pinpoint what changed for them, why they started to think differently about your association with it?
It all started with a lot of the environmental stuff. I think when did the New York Times article come out, and when did Alex DeVries start publishing that the Bitcoin, is destroying the environment webpage? I think that was around that same time. I remember that was when the conversation went from, it's just for nerds on the internet to, it's gonna destroy the environment. I think that was about the same time. So after the Sanders campaign is when I really saw the shift. There was obviously some who would still listen, but it was different.
Well, one of the reasons we are chatting today is your association with a paper on Bitcoin that has made its rounds as the paper to cite when expressing concern about Bitcoin's energy use. That's been mentioned during congressional hearings, the ECB, and numerous media outlets. And of course, I'm referring to the Mora et al. Paper. Can you walk us through how that paper came to be and what's problematic with it?
Sure. So, Camilo Mora is a rock star scientist at UH. He's got dozens of publications in all the best journals, and he really does good work. One of the classes he teaches at UH is an undergrad 300 level, so it's mostly STEM students, NREM, the department my wife came out of, geology, oceanography students, global environmental science. And one of the point of this class that he was teaching is for undergrads to, pick a topic, learn about that topic, and then walk through the publishing process. Well, for this particular class, the topic was Bitcoin, and I had at the time I was there's this Friday night Pauhana event where, all the graduate students and undergrads who are over 21 get together. We drink beer and, talk story. And of course, I ran that at one point and attended it for the entirety of my time at both undergrad and grad. And one of, as anybody who learns about Bitcoin talks about it, so it was a frequent topic of conversation. And one of my close friends, who was a TA of mine as an undergrad and a colleague of mine in the SOAS school, was Katie Talladay. She is a wonderful scientist as well, and a friend. She was the TA for this class with Camilo, and the idea was proposed by the TAs at the time to spend the whole semester learning about Bitcoin. And I was really the only one at the time talking about Bitcoin from sort of an academic standpoint around campus. Most people would just essentially write me off and either walk away from the conversation as soon as it turns out everything is related back to money. And so you can relate every topic of conversation back to, Bitcoin in some twisted way. But she was one of the only people who would actually engage. So we would, as other people would leave the conversation, we would sit there for hours and talk about Bitcoin. Her brother got into Bitcoin after me talking to her for so long. And, I think one day we used to live in the same neighborhood and we ran into her. She comes up and says, "My brother's doing very well, thanks to you." So that's, I don't know for sure, but it sounds like a pretty coincidental thing, right? That they just decided to talk about Bitcoin, and then the paper comes out and it's, Bitcoin's going to push us over the edge, right? It was after the, DeVries. So when you Google Bitcoin, the New York Times ran the piece. So you Google Bitcoin and first thing that comes up, well, it's not going to be any of the, monetary policy or anything like that. It's the environmental problems with Bitcoin was the first thing. So it makes sense why they would write it. And it's an environmental science class. So looking at that side, it just makes sense for them.
What are the problems then that have come about with regard to the paper? What does it get wrong?
Yeah, so the title of the paper is Bitcoin emissions alone could put us over the 2 degrees C or something like that. And they assume that, Bitcoin becomes the medium of transaction, the medium of exchange for all electronic payments. Then they use Visa level transactions and they say, okay, well, if Bitcoin uses this amount of energy today to do, 10 transactions per second, what happens if we scale that to Visa level? And they do this linear, this linear model where, transactions scale linearly with energy use. And we know that's not true, but you can't really expect an undergraduate class to understand that in a semester. And so they get this outrageous amount of energy use. And they looked at where the major the countries where the major mining operations were happening and used the energy makeup of the whole country to make this estimate, right? So, while, China uses mostly coal to power their country, they didn't take, the regional scale. It's about the scale of where you're looking. You really have to break it down by mining operation. You can't look at the whole country. What Texas uses to mine Bitcoin and what, Inner Mongolia uses are, two vastly different things. Even though the U.S. is mostly powered by oil, a lot of the Texas stuff is powered by solar, right? So you even have to, you need a much more granular look at it. And it was the work of undergrads. So, it wasn't meant to be taken seriously, but it sort of has.
In light of that, in light of the mistakes that were made in the calculations, should Mora consider retracting the paper?
Retracting is kind of a big deal for an author in general, especially for some of the I think Randy Rollins is the second author on there. She's a good friend of my wife, and her, we know her daughter and her husband, and she's still a PhD student. And I think a better, I guess it would be a retraction, but to edit it and just say, well, because the problem is that not necessarily the math that they use, not necessarily the model. It's that they're describing a network that isn't Bitcoin at that point, and just an update to it would be probably a better option. Saying that this isn't Bitcoin. I mean, he's been out. Camilo came out. He did a NPR interview and admitted that it was written by undergraduates as well. But yeah, it's retraction is difficult, and so there's all these competing interests involved. But yeah, it's a 2-page note. It's not. It doesn't really warrant a retraction because it's a 2-page note. It's not an actual, paper in the same way as a thesis or any of his other papers. It's a it's kind of like it's like, oh, here's some hand wavy math. It's just not meant to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. You and I both know that, but it's obviously had this outsized effect.
Yeah.
So it would be nice to have some type of perhaps outsized follow-up for it. But at this same time, you were, I believe, floating an idea, I suspect a preliminary idea to your current company, where you were trying to discuss Bitcoin and its energy integration. So you were talking to your colleagues and professors about this idea. But from what I understand, they repeatedly dismissed you and at times even insulted you because of your interest in Bitcoin. And so I'm really kind of curious to know how did you handle that at the time, and why did you not quit, throw the towel in and say to hell with Bitcoin?
It was at the time I was deep into oceanography. I was a graduate student, and energy topics are a frequent topic of conversation. Just talking about energy, and I would talk to some of my more grizzled professors, and they were quite pessimistic about our ability as a society to make the changes necessary to avoid catastrophe. And I always thought, as a young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed graduate student, I was always like, oh yeah, solar and wind can really change the world. Why don't we just go all solar? And you do some back of the hand math and say, okay, have 1 kilowatt per meter squared. We could run the whole world on a solar farm in the Sahara. Crazy projects like that. And then I started. As you take more classes, you learn more. You realize the intricacies of the grid and how difficult that is. So I started looking at, like how would we actually go about solving it? And essentially, it would take a industrial revolution, a complete mobilization of the global, workforce, manpower to making this change. I mein, upending the entire energy grid would be just it's a gargantuan task. And so I would look at what are the incentives. So I had teachers, professors around me that would study carbon credits, carbon dividends. They'd come to class, they'd do guest lectures or have lectures on campus about all these solutions, and they all just kind of fell short because they all rely on jurisdictional power. The US can influence things in the US, but not everywhere. And it's not necessarily that the US, we use a lot of energy, granted, and we've been the problem for 100 plus years now. But how can we industrialize the developing world without carbon? And none of their solutions address that. And this was, Bitcoin has this, the energy part, and it's the proof of work. People talk about, blockchain technology is the magic. No, it's the proof of work. And at the core of Bitcoin it's an energy technology. And so I looked at, I started reading C++ books to read the core repository, Bitcoin Core, and it started to come together that, hey, as with each halvening, the reward gets less and less, and the competition gets steeper and steeper, and eventually, it's kind of like a frog in a boiling pot of water. Eventually, you're gonna either jump. You're gonna have to jump out if you have too much. Like right now, the S9s are having to turn off because they're reaching their profitability cutoff. And so the higher the cost of energy, the less you'll be able to mine, the less profitable it is. So as time goes on, the energy sources that will survive are those that have the lowest marginal cost. And, by definition, having to extract that oil in one location, transport it to a processing facility, then transport it again to the end user. This all has, OpEx. It's OpEx heavy. Oil has always been operational expense heavy. Whereas, renewables that haven't really enjoyed that same 100-year, development that brought the capex of, a coal power plant. You can buy coal power plants right off the line. They're relatively cheap as far as capex. Your major ongoing cost is going to be that oil. That renewables, while they have a high capex, they have this extremely low operational expense where, and the result of that is the curtailment problem, where you're generating too much energy while the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and you end up just having to turn your windmill off or turn your PV panel off. And so I realized that, hey, Bitcoin provides this, and I hate to say this as a progressive, this private sector incentive to build out the renewable energy technology worldwide. In the beginning, same sort of incentive that was there for fossil fuels. At the turn of the century, there was this massive profit motive to build out fossil fuels 150 years ago. There was government subsidies as well, but there was this profit motive where if you built that infrastructure, you would, they gave you a utility, which is essentially a state-sponsored monopoly forever. And that Bitcoin provided that incentive for the world. And so I would shop this around. I wrote, I think it was 14 or 17 page paper or something, and shop it around to professors in the department, environmental scientists, economists, and some of the ones who would actually engage with me they would love the idea, and I tried to avoid Bitcoin as much as possible. But eventually they go, what is this magic technology that turns renewable energy into money? And I go, well, it's Bitcoin. And some were not happy. I got called a scammer by Dr. Michael Roberts. I was told to drop out and go work for the Winklevoss twins, which I guess probably would have been a good idea. Being employee number, low number over at Gemini would have been a good career decision. And even one of my wife's advisors, PhD advisors, just wrote it off. There were some, like my PI, Dr. Christopher Sabine, who actually gave me reviews on the paper. But after all the negative feedback, it was kind of demoralizing. Sure. And I don't know. It's once you read the core repository and understand it, you get discouraged, you get, beat down a little, but it's a brain bug. It's there forever. You can't really leave it.
The core repository kept you motivated. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I asked you about your how you handled being discouraged and insulted by your mentors, and you basically just took care of the rest of the podcast. But we'll continue on. So, to that point, you kind of alluded to this, but what are environmentalists who dismiss Bitcoin, what are they missing?
A lot of environmental scientists also don't understand the grid, right? Because the grid, the energy infrastructure, energy grid is an economic sort of, it's business, right? And so they look at it like all energy use is bad. The push is for, cutting down your electricity, increasing efficiency of energy use, because they're looking at it like fossil fuels, right? Where every bit of energy must be coming from fossil fuels. And so the less energy you use, the more efficient you are with your devices, the better that is for the environment. And they look at it like, oh, if I generate a watt over here in Hawaii, that you can just magically transport that watt to the mainland, and it's fungible. They think energy is fungible, is one of the big assumptions that they make. And the major problem is that all energy use must be bad. Anything that they don't consider as productive is bad. But they don't understand the incentives and how infrastructure gets built. OPEX and CapEx are not things environmentalists talk about very often. How do you build? You ask a lot of people just, solar and wind. And they don't understand the incentives, that the marginal cost of energy, the societal changes that need to happen for renewable energy to really proliferate. They don't really understand the business side of the grid.
Let alone how those proposed solutions would be applied to non-Western countries and continents.
Right.
You can't expect the same solutions to be applied to the global South. I'm curious to get your thoughts. One of the most interesting parts of Bitcoin history is in 2009 when Hal Finney tweets thinking about how to reduce CO2 emissions from a widespread Bitcoin implementation. You ever thought about what he was thinking?
I had never seen that tweet until you brought it up.
Yeah, 2009, I think it was January, is one of his second or third tweets.
Really? It makes sense. Just the happening itself, that's how you reduce the emissions. Curtailment essentially has a negative marginal cost. It actually costs money to turn the windmill off in the middle of the day. And so, if you can guarantee, you have when you're building a new wind farm, you have to do all these calculations for, curtailment rate. And it's going to be site specific. So, it's hard to generalize this curtailment rate across a region. So, when you're running the numbers on whether to build a new wind farm or solar farm, you have to, calculate your capacity value. And for Hawaii, Oahu specifically, the capacity value of centralized PV is around 6%, and the capacity value of wind is around 16%. So what that means is that in order to meet 100 megawatts of load on the grid, for centralized solar, you need 16x. So you would need 1.6 gigawatts of solar plus battery to meet that 100 megawatts of load. And this is the difference between intermittent energy and base load. Intermittent energy is only useful when it's happening, and you have to find some way to shift that demand. And most people think batteries, but the problem is that there's not quite enough lithium in the world to support that kind of battery infrastructure. And I would be surprised if Satoshi himself didn't think of this as a renewable energy technology. He must have been thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure he had similar thoughts to what you expressed previously and perhaps what your company is trying to do. So let's talk about that. First, walk us through ocean thermal energy conversion. What is it? What is OTEC?
So ocean thermal energy conversion is a 150-year-old technology. It was actually theorized at the same time that the first hydroelectric dams were being produced. So in the 1870s, 1880s, and it's a heat engine. So, they were looking at the time, oil wasn't necessarily going to be the winner at the time. And so everybody was looking at where you can find, energy. And they proposed using this difference in temperature between the surface ocean and the deep ocean. So, in the tropics where the sun is shining on the ocean, it heats up the water. And due to the, thermodynamic properties of water, that heat lasts all night. And the way that the thermohaline circulation works is that hot water is moved north. If you're on the East Coast, you know this as the Gulf Stream. When it gets to the poles where it's very cold, you get ice formation, sea ice formation, and that leaves behind extra salty, super cold water, which is very dense because density is a function of temperature and salinity. And so that water sinks down to the bottom of the ocean where it circulates around until eventually being upwelled. So, at the tropics, you have this nice warm water, and then down below you have very, very cold water. And with any temperature differential, there's the opportunity to generate energy. And it's I think the first plant was built in the 1930s. Then they figured out that they need to hurricane-proof it when a hurricane destroyed it. And then they found oil. And there was no real political will to rebuild it because now you had this cheap, Middle Eastern oil that was super abundant. And so it dropped off, as a endeavor. There have been I think 14 or so plants built over the last, since then, all testing stuff. And it works based on this temperature differential. And what you do is you run a heat engine. It's called a Rankine cycle. And you have this working fluid. So in our case, we use ammonia. And the warm water can evaporate that ammonia. And then there's a low pressure turbine that you can use that evaporated ammonia to spin. Then you condense it with that cold water. And this is in a closed loop, so that ammonia doesn't, leak out. But and you just run it in a closed cycle loop over and over again, just condensing it and evaporating it and turning a turbine using the temperature difference.
And so why have these not been feasible as a source of electricity for, in this case, Hawaii?
So it's actually, OTEC has been in the our renewable portfolio plan for a long time, but the problem has always been an economy of scale. It's been an economies of scale problem. Once you get to scale, you've got this cheap energy source that's available, but we're talking about 100 megawatt size, and at that point, there's you have about a 35-foot pipe dropping down 1,000 meters into the ocean. 35-foot diameter pipe that drops down 4,000 feet into the ocean. And there's a lot of engineering challenges involved with that. And so you could go straight to 100 megawatt OTEC with the giant pipe, but you're going to have to figure out these environmental challenges kind of on the fly. So, there's risk involved. So, that makes investment into a new technology kind of, more risky. So, like with most technologies, you build a smaller version. So there have been a number of tests at the 100 kilowatt scale. There's a 100 kilowatt plant on the Big Island of Hawaii, but those are testing scales. You need to build something at scale, like a prototype scale, something between 5 and 20 megawatts. The pipe is manageable size, rather than you have to build this bespoke pipe. You can order these pipes right off the assembly line. They're commercially available, and the problem is that it's the economy of scale. At that 5 to 20 megawatt, you're talking about $100-200 million investment in something that is going to provide energy at too high of a cost for anybody to pay. Here in Hawaii, we pay around 30 plus cents per kilowatt hour already, which is much higher than anywhere else in the country. If I try to tell people, oh, I've got this great renewable energy that once we build it at this scale, you'll get cheaper energy, but at this scale, you're going to be paying 50 cents to $1 for it. There's no buyer for that. Nowhere in the world can afford that cost of energy. So, essentially it would be a complete financial loss. And that's really been what's keeping it. So, we've partnered with Mackay Ocean Engineering, who built the 100 kilowatt plant on the Big Island. And they've been doing this for 40 years. And they've had to pivot into the kind of the peripheral industry. So your seawater AC, so using the cold water supply, not to generate energy, but to cool buildings down. They can use the water for nutrients, to produce spirulina, and they do heat exchange work. But OTEC is just, as an energy generation, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. There's been a number of, hurricane destroyed the first one, and then a hurricane destroyed the second one. And then they decided, let's hurricane proof these things. So it got more expensive to build. It's just the economies of scale have been preventing it for so long.
So how is OceanBit Energy trying to solve the economy of scale problem?
So we are integrating Bitcoin into this. It turns out that by optimizing OTEC for Bitcoin production, you can drastically cut the capex of one of these prototype scales. And by optimizing Bitcoin for OTEC, you can drastically increase the efficiency of Bitcoin production. So, this 100 megawatt, let's take a 100 megawatt example. You don't want this on land because you have this giant pipe that now you have to run out to, 1,000-meter deep water. And one of the major expenses is your giant seawater pipe. In order to cut those costs, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So, you want to drop it straight down. And so what you do is you have, instead of having a land-based OTEC plant, you have a plant ship offshore about 10 kilometers from Hawaii. You have access to super deep water. So you can save quite a bit of capex there. But if you're connecting it to land, you have this long high voltage cable. And that, again, you're talking about $40 to $100 million for that. But if nobody's going to buy that energy at the 10 megawatt scale, well, you don't really need it. So you can cut capex there. If you don't have that tether to land, because nobody's going to buy that energy anyway, you don't really need a mooring. And without that mooring, here in Hawaii, even though it's warm compared to Minnesota, the water in Minnesota is much colder. But even here, it's not ideal. We're sort of at the upper bounds of the tropics. I think we're at 21 degrees north. And the way the OTEC cycle works is it's that delta T, the change in temperature between the warm and the cold. And the efficiency of the energy scales with the square of that delta T. So if we're not tethered to Hawaii, there's no need to be in Hawaii. So we can go find the highest delta T in the ocean. And that improves the efficiency of this by almost a factor of 2x. So, essentially we can, with the capex of a 5 megawatt plant, we can generate 10 megawatts of energy. So that's a huge, improvement in the capex. And then once you're in the middle of the ocean, turns out at the equator, there's no hurricanes. So you don't have the reoccurring problem of these OTEC plants that are, on small island nations getting, brutalized by hurricanes. So you can cut that hurricane proofing. You get the increase in the energy efficiency. And it's called grazing. And it's not actually a new idea. It's been proposed before, but again, there was no buyer of energy in the middle of the ocean. And so, my my background in oceanography and Bitcoin, I sort of put them together saying, hey, a Bitcoin mine doesn't have lots of bandwidth. And I've been to sea and I can stream YouTube videos. And if you can stream YouTube videos, you can mine Bitcoin. Why not use Bitcoin as a buyer of last resort in the middle of the ocean? And then what you can do is to push the efficiency of those miners. One of the waste products of the OTEC cycle is cold water, unlimited amounts of, near freezing water. One of the major expenses of mining Bitcoin is cooling those machines. So, you have to power them and you have to cool them. So integrating that cold water supply into cooling these machines essentially reduces the power use efficiency of a Bitcoin data center to around 1. So you have 100% of your energy use going straight to mining Bitcoin. And then you can cool these machines far deeper than anyone else. So you're able to, squeeze more hash rate out of each machine with no added cooling costs. And we think we can, at least what we're seeing, we think we can reach break even on a 10 megawatt plant in the middle of the ocean.
And so then at what point have you proved out the idea and then in turn can be applied to connecting it to the mainland?
Yeah, so once we run that to the 10 megawatt plant, that'll prove it out. Because of that economy of scale, there's been no testing done at large scale OTEC implementation. And doing it at the equator means you're going to solve a lot of those problems with the cold water pipe. You have to get this 1,000-meter, 1 kilometer long pipe out into the ocean. And then you have to connect it to the bottom of your ship. And there's gimbaling involved. So a lot of those problems, that are associated with the 100 megawatt are solved at this prototype scale in this environment that isn't, as rough. You don't have to worry about the hurricane coming and something going wrong with the pipe. So you solve a lot of those problems at the 10 megawatt scale, and then you can do research onto the impact of even though OTEC is a renewable energy source, building anything has an impact, right? Anything you dam the river, and for hydroelectric, you're changing the way that the river flows. So there's environmental impact there. Geothermal, you have land use changes. Solar, wind, you're having to bulldoze whatever's in the way. So there's all these land use changes. And there's it's different because it's in the ocean, but there's potential to change the sort of trophic structure. Anytime you have a big thing in the ocean, it attracts a lot of the apex predators. So you get, lots of tuna, swordfish, sharks, stuff like that. And the water has, lots of nutrients. So you're sort of seeding primary production. It's called artificial upwelling. And a lot of those effects haven't been studied just because nobody's been able to build OTEC at scale. So you kind of, solve a lot of these problems at the 10 megawatt scale, the engineering challenges, some of the environmental questions. And at that point, if you run it for, a year, 2 years, it's off to the races.
And so where can this technology be applied? And are there specific countries along the equator that you've actually considered rolling this out to outside of Hawaii?
Yeah, there's over 100 countries / jurisdictions that OTEC is applicable to. The two conditions are you need to be within the tropics, so 23 to 23, 23 north to 23 south, and you have to have deep cold water available within your economic exclusion zone. So that's 200 kilometers from the coast. Obviously you have to be near the water. You can't do this in the middle of the continent, but there's over 100 jurisdictions, and that covers around 1 billion people. And it's really, they're only, for a lot of island nations, solar doesn't cut it. It's not a base load. They have limited land resources anyway, and OTEC is the only renewable energy source that can power these places. Places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Nigeria, and at the coast. Yeah.
So, assuming that these same countries would have to use more carbon-intensive sources for their energy, have there been estimates as to how OTEC might be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, actually, me and my wife were playing around with ArcGIS the other day, and we did a map, real rough map of all. There's great data on all the known power plants in the world, and so we took the countries where we know some of the country that those 100 countries aren't included in the power plant database, but we found all the countries where the locations work out, and there's, I think it's 1,041 carbon-based plants. So oil, coal, natural gas, combined cycle, where theoretically OTEC could replace, and that ends up being around 300 gigawatts of base load that theoretically OTEC could replace in one capacity or another. Some of those locations aren't ideal for a direct hookup to land, because the further out that deep water is, the cost of the cable scales with the length. But what you could do is you could have offshore hydrogen, green hydrogen production, and then just transport the hydrogen onshore.
That is incredibly interesting. But what I'm most actually concerned about is that this was a date night activity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. So you've spoken at a few events in Hawaii about your idea. And what has been the reception?
Really, really positive. Yeah, I spoke at I do some work with the Department of Financial Institutions through their Digital Currency Innovation Lab. I gave a talk there about the I think it's called Hawaii Energy and Bitcoin, or Bitcoin Energy in Hawaii. And I go through what it would look like to replace just a single one of our fossil fuel-based plants with solar and with wind, and the answer is you can't. If you wanted to replace the one plant that's 600 megawatts with an offshore wind farm, you would need an offshore wind farm the size of the island of Oahu itself, and that would be just absolutely environmentally devastating to the deep sea community here. And that OTEC is even waves. Waves are intermittent source as well. And even with 100% sighting of all of Oahu's shoreline, you still only get 12% of our actual needs on Oahu. And OTEC is the only renewable energy source that can power Oahu. And if, for the listeners who aren't familiar, Oahu is where Honolulu is. It's the main population center of the state. There's about 1 million people living on the island of Oahu alone, and around 400,000 in the rest of the across the rest of the island.
So it sounds like it's been well received.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked with there's a couple of companies. I think OceanBit is one of the big tech companies on island, and they hosted the talk. And I worked with Mackay Ocean Engineering on some of the the cost estimates for OTEC and modeling. And I call up these guys. They built the plant on the Big Island in 2015. I've been doing it for 40 years. I call them up like, hey, I'm doing this thing, and so I'm talking with the lead OTEC engineer, and we just keep going back and forth. Shaving capex, increasing the efficiency. And the numbers keep coming back, better and better. And so eventually, I formed OceanBit Energy, kind of a play on words with OceanIt. And we, Mackay is on board. They're working with us now. They're our, engineering partners on this to make it happen. Our phase one is we're restarting the 100 kilowatt OTEC plant on the Big Island. We want to make sure that, that the assumption that OTEC and Bitcoin production, reduces that PUE to zero, find out exactly how much we can push the mining efficiency to, and then from there, we're going to build out containerized versions of OTEC. So it would be the first, commercial OTEC product ever. We want to build out 250 kilowatt container. Half of that container is OTEC and half of the container is Bitcoin mining. So a container that has the energy, the cooling, and the Bitcoin all within the unit. So it's, modular. It would be, a first of its kind. And then from there, we want to scale that out to the 10 megawatt size.
Just incredible. Such a fascinating idea. But we cannot end without talking about manganese balls.
Yes, manganese nodules. Yes.
What are they?
So in the middle of the ocean, you have this desert. Essentially, there's no nutrients in the ocean because they've all been used up for primary production. And in the middle of the ocean, there's nothing above, so nothing rains down. And the seafloor is usually made up of whatever is raining down from above. So if you're at the mouth of a riverbed, you get a lot of terrigenous material. If there's a lot of primary production, you get, tiny little shells, you get, all sorts of stuff. In places where the, Saharan sand blows in, you get sandy bottoms. But in the middle of the ocean, there's just nothing raining down. So it creates this environment where the only thing floating around is all these metals, and they sort of, aggregate into these, volleyball size balls of metal that are, sitting right at the surface of the sea floor. They're called manganese nodules. They're made out of, their main component is manganese, but they contain copper, cobalt, iron, nickel, trace metals, and some lithium. And there's 4 main regions for them around the world. And, each region has a different composition based on where they are. And they all happen to be within the range of OTEC. And, these things have been known since the 60s, 70s. UH helped find them. And a lot of the research being done on them launches from Hawaii, since the largest area, the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, is about 1,000 kilometers southeast of us. And they just contain these metals, that we need. Cobalt is one that's particularly in need of. And so there's this potential to, mine these manganese nodules to support, battery and PV use as well. But the problem has always been, again, capital expense. And, they essentially you're sending a Hoover vacuum, tethered Hoover vacuum down to 4,500 meters depth, and you're just sucking these manganese nodules up. And this requires a lot of energy in the middle of the ocean. And so previously you had to have fossil fuels, right? You had to have a giant power plant on board to support the the equipment. And we think potentially OTEC could provide an extra an energy source for this, dropping the cost of retrieving them.
So it sounds like there's an international organization that's in charge of these nodules, and the United States disassociated itself from that to a certain degree, from my understanding. And what I'm getting at is, who owns the rights to these manganese nodules?
So the ISA is a division of the UN. It's the International Seabed Authority, and it's been charged with permitting. So there's a number of regions that have been, defined, and it issues permits for extraction. Each region is split up into 2 sections, one for preservation and the other for mining activity. And then in that mining activity, it's further split in half from the permitted country, and then the other half, so a quarter is for the permitted country, and the other quarter is reserved for developing nations. So where once minerals on land kind of just fall under whoever happens to control that area at the time, these are in international waters. So there's the opportunity to give mining rights to countries that have no mining, that don't have deposits for. So there's this potential to share that wealth a little bit. And so they've split up the Clarion-Clipperton zone. I forget how many countries now, and they're actually having to. The first country put in a permit, an application to commence mining activities last year in September, which gives the ISA a 2-year time period to issue regulation and guidelines for extraction. So the clock is kind of ticking.
Any idea what the environmental implications are for the removal?
Terrible. Yeah. Oh, they're awful. Just like extraction of any minerals anywhere, right? It's there's a benthic community down there that's pretty unique. You're 4,500 meters down. There's no light. So you have this unique benthic community. They live on the seafloor. It's not the density of, the population density is rather low, but the diversity is extremely high. These are extremophiles, right? They live on essentially no food, and, a lot of them are drifter, filter feeders. And so when you pull them up, you have this Hoover vacuum, right? Creates a big dust cloud that essentially anything in that dust cloud, anything in its way is virtually guaranteed to die. There have been studies in the past, and even 45 years later, things don't return to where they once were. And so really, physical oceanographers are really, really going to be key here. Understanding how that dust plume moves, how it settles, making sure that the regions that are protected, maintain that diversity. And then you have to return. There's a return flow, obviously. You bring the metals up, but you're also bringing up sediment. You have to return that. So there's a secondary plume, and then dissipation of that as well as a problem. And then, so there's a number of environmental issues. And I guess the question is, what's the alternative? Do we continue cobalt extraction in the Congo? Who benefits from the Congo, cobalt mining?
Right.
Is it Boko Haram that's in the Congo, or is it Al-Shabaab? I forget. There's child labor involved. It's an unequitable distribution of the world's mineral resources. And so, like all mining activities, we're going to have to make that decision. And I mean, I think it's an inevitability that we're going to go get them anyway. Yeah, I think it's inevitable because we're going to have to. I mean, there's more of these minerals available at the bottom of the seafloor than there are on land.
Right. That was my immediate thought, is if these were mined, a lot of them are the same metals used in, as you said, PV. And so if the United States did that, for example, our reliance on China and Russia for the same materials would lessen.
Yep.
Arguably pointing us more towards energy independence. But like you said, there's always needs to be compared and not taken in isolation. So just 2 more questions for you, Nathaniel, if that's all right.
Sure.
You are a Democrat. You've supported Bernie Sanders. There's no denying your commitment to the environment and fighting climate change. So I was hoping if you could summarize your progressive case for Bitcoin.
I don't see any other way to fight climate change that doesn't involve Bitcoin. There's just no way to make this transition. We haven't done it fast enough already. The government has had so many years and has done nothing. And now we need to do it faster than ever. And there's I hate to say it, I think mobilizing the private market at this point with some incentive mechanism is really the only way to do it. Again, the freedom to move is progressive. Bitcoin is apolitical. We ascribe our own belief structures onto it. And so, in the early days, there was a lot of libertarians, came at it for the monetary policy. But, I looked at the programming side, and what I saw was essentially, communism. The open source software, there's no one getting paid for it. Each person to their own. Everybody contributes to this shared project altruistically. Whereas the monetary policy might be, more libertarian focused, the development of it is rather progressive. So somehow Satoshi Nakamoto managed to combine these two diametrically opposed ideologies into a single project. And, again, redistribution of wealth. That's right out of Occupy Wall Street. I wish Elizabeth Warren could see the mass redistribution event. It's the first asset in human history where corporations and the powerful didn't have access to it first. Every other asset, it's been, big money interests had access to it before everybody. This is the first one where, those on rails for the, corporations, the powerful, just didn't exist until 2020. And I'm not against CBDCs either. I think they're, it provides this balance. I'm not anti, fiat. I see the benefit in the ability to print money. You can solve, one of the questions I've always had is if you have the ability to print unlimited amounts of money, why are children still starving? Why are schools underfunded? Why are hospitals underfunded? Why don't we have, universal health care? But we have unlimited war, right? I see Bitcoin as this sort of counterbalance, this check and balance against the unproductive use of that ability to, print money. If the government starts getting out of hand and funds, unproductive uses, now you have this, counterbalance. And, checks and balances are the cornerstone of democracy. And I think, Bitcoin can provide that for a lot of developing nations and the developed world as well.
Perfect. My last question for you, Nathaniel, is what gives you hope?
Yeah, it's a tough one, man. I mean, Bernie was a big hope. Then after watching, we won in 2016, we won 70% of the state vote, and then lost because of superdelegates. So, yeah, Bitcoin gives me hope for a better world. But honestly, there's going to be a lot of hurt. A lot of these regions you're going to be uninhabitable. I mean, you're seeing it now. Massive droughts all over the world, massive fires. You're in Southeast Asia. The Mekong is being diverted for China's usage, but downstream of China, you have major drought. It's been 3 years now, and Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, unable to produce nearly enough food. So there's this potential, mass migration that's going to happen, and with any mass migration, you're going to get lots of suffering. And so, with OTEC, there's this potential for unlimited amounts of energy. And with an unlimited amount of energy, you can solve unlimited problems. So Bitcoin.
Perfect. Thank you. This is extremely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. Please tell the listeners where they can find you and your work.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at blockchainhi1. That's the best place to find me.
Fantastic. Nathaniel, thank you so much.
Aloha.
Hey, don't forget to please leave a review of the podcast. It'll take you 2 seconds to hit that 5-star button. I really appreciate it.